a dicot. This is also a dicot. And so is this. Can you tell what they all have in common? Okay, maybe not yet. So let's look at some monocots and compare. Here's one that's familiar to most people, popcorn. And here's rice. Have you figured it out yet? If not, let's move on and look at the words themselves. Their full names are monocotyledon and dicotyledon, but most people just say monocot and dicot for short. They both have the same ending, so to spot the difference, let's look at the prefixes. Mono means one, and di means two. But one or two what? Well, the long and short of it is one or two parts of the seed. Let's take a look back at those seeds from earlier. When we zoom in, we can see that the dicots clearly have two halves. The monocots only have one of these parts, or cotyledons, in their seed. There may be times it might be hard to tell though. Take this wheat for example. It may look like it's in two parts, but what you see, that line down the middle, is actually where the embryo is. But if you look closely, you can see that it's only on the fronts, not the backs, showing that it's not split all the way through. The seeds aren't where we find the only differences between monocots and dicots. There are also differences in the roots, vascular systems, leaves, and flowers. To look at this, let's take a look at my monocot versus dicot experiment. Now, to start with, I chose possibly one of the worst ways to do this experiment. I chose to do it in glass, and I also did it in a container that doesn't drain. Guys, there are so many better ways to do it, and I'll get into those in a minute, but this will work if you're short on money or time. Some of the better ways to do this would be to do it in clear cups, jars, whatever you have on hand, to do it in clear baggies, to grow it in gelatin or agar, or, as I later did, in clear Orbeez. This way you can see the whole root system a lot better. If you are going to do it with paper towels or napkins, using dark paper towels and napkins does help you see the root system better as well. If you don't do it in a growing medium, such as the gelatin or the soil or the Orbeez, you will need a paper towel or something like that to be able to keep the seeds moist. Back to the experiment. Here we can start to see the difference between monocots and dicots as they grow. As you can see in this photo, you have a single root that's starting to come down, and yet you don't have a shoot yet. However, if you look over here at the dicot, in this case a bean seed, you can see that it's both the root and shoot that are growing out at the same time. It's easier to see in my Orbeez one here that's at a similar stage. What's interesting about the dicots that you don't see with the monocots is that you have a continuous root and shoot, and there's not a distinctive difference between the roots and the shoots at the beginning, at least visually. Here you can see a clear difference between the root and the shoot of the monocot. It is easier to tell though with the pea seed, which is also a dicot. I think that's also largely due not only to the anatomy of the different seeds and plants, but also that the shoot is coming up first here in the pea plant. What's interesting is that you can see really clearly here in the bean that the dicots will actually bring their cotyledons up with them as they're growing, especially things like beans. And those actually become what are called the seed leaves. They're not true leaves. When you get your first true leaves, they're thinner and you'll be able to tell. But these do come up and they spread out and they do look like leaves at first. The peas, as you can see, were really the first thing to really pop up out of the soil. Here you can actually see on the corn as it shoots up, you can see the little white cap on the tip of it, and it will eventually grow through that and turn into the green corn shoots that we all know. And obviously as they grow, both their root system and shoot system get more and more complex, and this is to support the growing plant. In this next photo, you can see the plants kind of reaching out for the sun on a day that they did not have the grow light on them, and that is an example of phototropism. And here's the last time I took pictures of them before ending the experiment and taking them out of the soil. And they're still reaching towards the sunlight a little bit. You can see that they're big and strong, and it's funny, so I actually turned this away from the sunlight, but it's funny, you can see that the ones that were towards the sunlight more often have actually gotten bigger than the ones that weren't, which makes sense because you need sunlight to photosynthesize. It's hard to see, but I also noticed that there was fungus here on this corn seed, the remains of the corn seed after it had grown. Finally, it was time to end the experiment and look at the root systems in their totality. So I very carefully took each one and untangled it from the soil and then soaked it in water and got the remaining soil off so that we could just look at the roots. You can't really tell because they're still young, but the peas and the beans actually have taproots. It's weird because at this stage it does look like the corn has a taproot and the peas and beans don't, but we'll take a closer look at that and we'll see why. Here you can tell that this has a taproot because all of the other smaller roots are coming off of this one main root here. It's the same with the bean, though harder to tell. With the corn, however, and unfortunately I didn't get a great picture of this, you have multiple roots coming off from the plant. If you look closely, you can see that there are multiple sort of main roots, and that's what makes this a fibrous root and not a taproot. Now this is another thing I didn't get great pictures of, but you can definitely see the difference in the venation between the monocots and the dicots. The monocots have parallel veining, whereas the dicots have more of a net. One of the beans actually still had one of its cotyledons still attached to it when I pulled it up. Unfortunately, it did fall off while I was handling it, but I got a good picture of it here. Finally, that brings us to the vascular system, and I took some longitudinal sections from the roots of each of the plants, the pea, the bean, and the corn, and as you can see, the pea and the bean have a very clear circular vascular system, whereas it's much more scattered in the corn. Hopefully that was at least a little bit helpful, and thank you for watching.